The Restoration Age. Restoration literature is the English literature written during the historical period commonly referred to as the English Restoration in the year 1660 to 1689, which corresponds to the last years of Stuart reign in England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. In general, the term is used to denote roughly homogeneous styles of literature that center on a celebration of or reaction to the restored court of Charles II. This period marks the British king's restoration to the throne after a long period of Puritan domination in England. Its symptoms include the dominance of French and classical influences on poetry and drama. Restoration literature continued to appeal to heroic ideals of love and honor, particularly on stage, in heroic tragedy. Here are some of the major writers in the Restoration Age. John Dryden. Charles II may have been King of England, but John Dryden was king of restoration in literature. He is by far the most important literary figure of the period. Not only was he a prolific writer who worked in a bunch of different genres including poetry, drama, and prose, but also he set the bar in terms of literary standards for the period. One important contribution he made was the popularization of the heroic couplet in English poetry. He also played a big part in establishing satire as an important literary mode during this period. Here are some of his major works. MacPhee. It is a classic work of the Restoration period. In it, Dryden makes fun of his literary rival, a poet by the name of Thomas Shadwell. The poem is so important because it was written as a mock epic, a satirical work that used the conventions of the epic genre to talk about trivial things. The Marriage Alamode. This is Dryden's most famous comedy. It's set in Sicily and it involves a number of romantic plotlines. Like a lot of comedies of the period, the play centers around trickery and misrecognition. William Congreve is a super important playwright of the Restoration period and a disciple of John Dryden's. He is known for his comedies which catered to the taste of that time, bawdy and full of sexual innuendo. Here are some of his major works. Love for Love. It is a comedy about love and money. It involves a romantic triangle between Valentine, his father Sir Thompson, and the woman they both fall in love with, Angelica. Love for Love is a typical Restoration comedy. In it, we find the usual themes of romance, trickery, and a focus on social class and social hypocrisy. The Way of the World. This is another comedy whose plot revolves around all sorts of romantic entanglements. The Way of the World is considered to be Congreve's most accomplished comedy. It was published right at the end of the Restoration period, in the year 1700s, at which point theatrical tastes were beginning to change. Next, we have John Locke. He was an English philosopher and physician, widely regarded as one of the most influential of Enlightenment thinkers, and commonly known as the father of liberalism. He was a 17th century English philosopher and social activist concerned primarily with governance, political theory, epistemology, and religious tolerance. Here are some of his works. The Two Treatises of Government. It is a work of political philosophy, published anonymously in 1689 by John Locke. The first treatise attacks patriarchalism in the form of sentence-by-sentence refutation of Robert Filmer's Patriarcha, while the second treatise outlines Locke's ideas for a more civilized society based on a natural rights and contract theory. An Essay Concerning Human Understanding is a work by John Locke concerning the foundation of human knowledge and understanding. It first appeared in 1689 with the printed title An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. He describes the mind at birth as a blank slate, tabula rasa, although he did not use those actual words, filled later through experience.
John Milton. He was a noted essayist, poet, and dramatist who produced popular but controversial work leading up to and during the Puritan regime. Exemplifying his work from that period is an essay called Areopagitica. It's a 1644 tract about the dangers of censorship that helped develop the concept of freedom of the press. So that's huge. But what he's probably most known for, and what you probably heard is conjunction with Milton's name, is the poem Paradise Lost from 1667. His major work, Paradise Lost, is a poem on an epic scale. That's because it's a poem that chronicles man's creation and fall from grace. Adam, Eve, Satan, God, and Christ are all the characters in this poem. To Thompson, Agonistes, 1671. Milton's play is a short tragedy based on the story of Samson in the Old Testament. Milton's play dramatizes Samson's fate after he finds himself prisoner of the Philistines. Like Paradise Lost, Samson Agonistes focuses on big biblical themes, adapting stories straight from the Bible. Next is Aphrodites, was an English playwright, poet, prose writer, and translator from the Restoration era. As one of the first English women to earn her living by her writing, she broke cultural barriers and served as a literary role model for later generations of women authors. Rising from obscurity, she came to the notice of Charles II, who employed her as a spy in Antwerp. Major works: The Robber, 1677. The Robber was a very popular comedy during the Restoration period. It's set in Italy, and it dramatizes the romantic entanglements of a group of young lovers there. Eurunico, 1688. Aphrodites' novel is one of the earliest examples of the novel. It tells the tale of an African prince, Eurunico, who is captured as a slave and taken to Suriname in South America. At the center of the novel is Eurunico's love for a beautiful woman. William Wycherley. William Wycherley spent part of his life in France and ended up super influenced by French literature and probably was a member of a big-wig fan club. Although he was supposed to train as a lawyer, he was obsessed with theater and devoted his time to writing plays when he was actually supposed to be studying law. Procrastination paid off for Willie, and now he's considered most of the important playwrights in the Restoration literature. Major works: The Country Wife, 1675. The Country Wife is Restoration comedy at its most scandalous. It's a play full of sexual intrigue and sex jokes, and well, just a whole bunch of people being very naughty. At the center of the play is Warner, a man who pretends that he's impotent so that he can have affairs with married women. A secondary plot involves Marjorie Pinchwife, a wife from the country who comes to London and is seduced by all that London has to offer. The Plain Dealer, 1676. The Plain Dealer is a comedy about a sailor, Captain Manly, who falls in love with a woman only to have her ditch him for a friend. It tells of a Captain Manly attempts to gain revenge on his ex-lover and her new man. As a continuation to the first discussion,
of Augustan period, which is one of the three stages of the Neoclassical period of literature, which date back around 1700s to 1750. It is called Augustan because King George I wanted people to think that he was like Augustus Caesar. This period is also marked by the imitation of Virgil and Horace's literature in English literature. There are a lot of famous writers during the Augustan period in the Neoclassical period. Among them is Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift was an Anglo-Irish satirist, essayist, political pamphleteer, poet, and Anglican cleric who became Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. Hence, his common sobriquet is Dean Swift. Swift targets the empiricists who insist on individual, unyielding reason over morality and social values. His best-known composition or famous work is called Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver's Travel is a four-part satirical novel written by Jonathan Swift that is both an adventure story and a devious philosophical reflection on the constitution of modern societies. It was published around 1726 as travels into several remote nations of the world. The summary of the story. The book is written in the first-person point of view of Lemuel Gulliver, a surgeon and a sea captain who visits remote regions of the world, and it describes four adventures. First, Gulliver swims to Lilliput as a survivor of a shipwreck. Gulliver's second voyage takes him to Brobdingnag, inhabited of a race of giants. Gulliver's third voyage, he is set adrift by the pirates and eventually ends up on the flying island of Laputa. On the last one, Gulliver's fourth voyage, is in the land of Houyhnhnms, a race of intelligent horses and degenerate humanoid race called Yahoos.
And now, let us tackle another important figure during the Augustan period, which is no other than Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope was a poet and satirist of the Augustan period and one of its greatest artistic exponents. Considered the foremost English poet of the early 18th century and a master of the heroic couplet, he is best known for satirical and discursive poetry. The earlier part of the 18th century or the Augustan age in English literature is called the Age of Pope because Pope was the dominating figure in that period. One of the famous work of Alexander Pope during the Augustan period is The Rape of the Lock. The Rape of the Lock is the best known work of the Augustan age. It is also Alexander Pope's most famous publication. It is a mock heroic and a wonderful example of high burlesque literature. It was published in 1712 and then later in 1714 in a new 5-canto version. The Rape of the Lock details in a small incident, satirizing it and comparing it to the epic, dramatic, and over-the-top of the world gods. It was based on real events and got to the heart of the aristocratic society. It begins when the speaker, Pope, declares that there was a dire offense. A man has assaulted a woman and she has rejected him.
Let us now proceed to the writers and works during Age of Johnson. The later half of the 18th century, which was dominated by Dr. Samuel Johnson, is called the Age of Johnson. The Age of Johnson in English poetry is an age of transition and experiment which ultimately led to the Romantic Revival. Its history is the history of the struggle between the old and the new, and the gradual triumph of the new. The greatest protagonist of classicism during this period was Dr. Johnson himself, and he was supported by Goldsmith. The poets who showed romantic leanings during the age of Johnson and who may be described as the precursors or harbingers of the Romantic Revival were James Thompson, Thomas Gray, William Collins, James Macpherson, William Blake, Robert Burns, William Calper, and George Krabb. James Thompson. James Thompson was the earliest 18th century poet who showed romantic tendency in his work. The main romantic characteristic in his poetry is his minute observation of nature. In the seasons, he gives his fine sympathetic descriptions of the fields, the woods, the streams, the shy and wild creatures. Instead of the closed couplet, he follows the Miltonic tradition of using the blank verse. Thomas Gray. Thomas Gray is famous as the author of Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, the best known in the English language. Unlike classical poetry, which was characterized by restraint on personal feelings and emotions, this poem is the manifestation of deep feelings of the poet. Other important poems of Gray are the Progress of Poesy and the Bard. Of these, the Bard is more original and romantic. It emphasizes the independence of the poet, which became the chief characteristic of romantic poetry. William Collins. William Collins, like the poetry of Gray, Collins' poetry exhibits deep in feelings of melancholy. His first poem, Oriental Eclogues, is romantic in feeling, but is written in the closed couplet. His best-known poems are the Odes to Simplicity, to Fear, to the Passions, the small lyric How Sleep the Brave, and a beautiful Ode to Evening. Collins in his poetry advocates return to nature and simple and unsophisticated life, which became the fundamental creeds of the Romantic Revival.
James Macpherson. In 1736 to 1796, he became the most famous poet during his time by the publication of oceanic poems called The Works of Ocean, which were translations of Gaelic folk literature, though the originals considered by some critics as a forgery. In spite of this, Macpherson exerted a considerable influence on contemporary poets like Blake and Burns by his poetry, which was impregnated with moonlight, melancholy, and ghostly romantic suggestions. William Blake. In 1757 to 1827, in the poetry of Blake, we find a complete break from classical poetry. In some of his works as Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, which contain the famous poems Little Lamb Who Made Thee and Tiger, Tiger Burning Bright, we are impressed by their lyrical quality. In other poems such as The Book of Tell, Marriage of Heaven and Hell, it is the poetic voice of Blake which appeals to the reader. In the words of Swinburne, Blake was the only poet of supreme and simple poetic genius of the 18th century, the man of that age fit, on all accounts, to rank with the old great masters. Some of his lyrics are, no doubt, the most perfect and the most original songs in the English language. Robert Burns. In 1759 to 1796, it is the greatest songwriter in the English language, had great love for nature, and a firm belief in human dignity and quality, both of which are characteristics of Romanticism. The fresh, inspired songs of Burns, as the Cutter's A Saturday Night, To a Mouse, To a Mountain Daisy, Man Was Made to Mourn, went straight to the heart, and they seemed to be the songs of the birds in springtime, after the cold and formal poetry for about a century. Most of his songs have the Elizabethan touch about them.
George Krabb, in 1754 to 1832, stood midway between the Augustans and the Romantics. In form, he was classical, but in the temper of his mind, he was romantic. Most of his poems are written in the heroic couplet, but they depict an attitude to nature which is Wordsworthian. To him, nature is a presence, a motion, and a spirit, and he realizes the intimate union of nature with man. His well-known poem, The Village, is without a rival as a picture of a working man of his age. He shows that the lives of the common villager and laborers are full of romantic interests. His later poems, The Parish Register, The Borough, Tales in Verse, and Tales of the Whole, are all written in the same strain. William Calper, in 1731 to 1800s, who lived a tortured life and was driven to the verge of madness, had a genial and kind soul. His poetry, much of which is of autobiographical interest, describes the homely scenes and pleasures and pains of simple humanity, the two important characteristics of Romanticism. His longest poem, The Task, written in blank verse, comes as a relief after reading the rhymed essays and the artificial couplets of the age of Johnson.